Appendix 7 is about roots. The easy explanation is that it's a series of maps to give you an idea that when I mention words like Bulgarians and Dacians and Thracians and so on, and the alphabets that are connected with them, that you are able to picture where they are on the map of Eurasia. If we look at the early period, around 1 AD, here is a 1st century AD map of the connections between the African coast and India. So we have this notion, yes, there must have been sailing ports, but very few of us realized that there were this many all the way along the coast. And here is a map of Austronesian migrations. Again, we've forgotten that it stretched all the way from Madagascar all the way to Chile. Here is an ancient map of about 30,000 BC that reminds us that India was linked to Sri Lanka via a submerged Tamil Nadu or an ancient Lemuria to Australia. And that Australia, in turn, was linked to another continent, now submerged, of which Zealandia, of which New Zealand is simply a little bit. So the picture that we have of the world is only a fraction of what actually existed. Also, our notion of where the boundaries of countries are. So here is an old map showing how big Ethiopia was. Here is another of such maps. So Ethiopia wasn't just something here up in the corner of Northeast Africa. It stretched all the way down to Middle Africa. Or here is Sheba. We think of the Queen of Sheba either on the coast of Saudi Arabia or here in Ethiopia. Here is the Abyssinian Empire. So all of these things, we have modern day maps in our mind for them, but in fact, the earlier maps were far extended and far different, and Sheba went all the way down to Madagascar. There are really two stories of transmission. One goes via the spice routes, and the other goes via the Great Silk Routes. And those Great Silk Routes in the 5th century BC got a special incentive when Cyrus, somewhere between 550 and 500, created the so-called Royal Road, or of the Achaemenid Empire, where he created really the first Pony Express. And that went all the way from what we now think of as Iran to Turkey. Here is a map of Abraham's journey from what is today Syria all the way down to Egypt before going back to Israel. In the first lecture, I showed you the great empires of Media and the Chaldeans, how Media then becomes the Persian Empire, and how Greater Iran has remained as the only major civilization over 5,000 years. I mentioned the Scythians as one of the sources of the languages, Scythian and then Scytho-Sarmatian, which leads us to Old Bulgarian. Well, Scythia, as I'll show you in the next maps, is an extremely complex concept. Here is an old map that shows you Scythia intra-Imaum, these are the mountains, and here is Scythia extra-Imaum, and here is Terra Incognito. And serika is an old word for silk, which is one of the words, this is one of the old names for China. So instead of thinking of Scythia as some tiny little kingdom, we see that it really stretches all the way through Russia, and that the extreme north was considered terra incognito, although here was the Scythian Ocean. Here are two more maps that show you this. Now we see Sarmatia Europea, and then there is also a Sarmatia Asiatica. Here again, Sarmatia Europea. So we're going, and here is Scythia in Europe. Well, this is Scythia Europea. And Sarmatia Europea is going all the way from Germany, past the Scandinavian countries, and all the way into Russia. Now, this is extremely important because if we are trying to understand how Russia, that enormous land, got a single language, we can't follow the normal explanation that it only got started along the borders of what we now think is Europe. Here are maps that I showed you in chapter 12. So one of the ways in which all of this connects is via the Turkic languages. But to understand the bigger picture, we have to realize that these Turks were not, well, they were way up there. There were Turco-Mongolian tribes, and then there was a Xiongnu Khanate that spread all the way from here to there. So we're covering from East Asia to Middle Asia. And then in the course of the centuries, we get the so-called Göktürk. So these are the celestial Turks. And they stretch all the way from what is now the Pacific coast, all the way to the Caspian Sea. And you see there's a split between these lighter ones and the darker ones. So these are the East Turks and the West Turks. And they become then the Hunlan, and that becomes the Hunnic Empire between 204 and 216 AD. So we're dealing with an area that is now the size of China and large bits of Russia. And that then becomes narrower and goes all the way from the Caspian. So before it was from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. Then by 200 years later, it comes from the Caspian Sea all the way to the edges of Europe. Sorry, back. And at its height, it covers this whole area. So it covers the Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, the whole of Belarus, and even bits of Russia. Sorry. And if we look at the so-called Uyghur kingdom that today is restricted to the Tarim Basin and considered part of West China, we see that it reaches, again, it includes the Eastern Turks, the Uyghurs, the Western Turks, and all the way, and Khwarezm, all the way to the Caspian Sea. And then these Huns from Mongolia go this way to Europe, and it's generally accepted that that's the reason why we have the name Hungary. And they all come from the Yenisei Basin up there in Siberia. And then there's a group that goes down to Iran, and a group that goes down to India, and a group that goes down to the Tarim Basin. Here you see some of the more complex movements. And we see that there is a group here from Khwarezm, from which we get all Khwarezmi from which we get the word algorithm from, interestingly enough. And one of those groups goes past Khazaria and becomes the Red Croatians. They go further and become the White Croatians, and then finally end up in Hrvatska, which we now think of as the real Croatia. So today we have this nice little map. Oh yes, Croatia's down there, and then there's Serbia and so on, and Bosnia and so on. But now we realize, no, wait, these people coming from the far east spread all over this part of Europe and then end up on the so-called Balkans. Similarly with the Avars start between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea and spread first through Europe, well, basically through Germany, France, and into Spain, then across Gibraltar, then along the coast, and then upwards into Sicily, Italy, Sardinia, and so on. Here is another map of those connections, and here we have a map showing how the Avars create a khanate, so a kingdom. And here we see the Western Göktürk. So this whole story of the movement of the Huns and the various celestial Turks is a way of understanding how those Turks that were way up there in Mongolia and Siberia end up becoming an extraordinarily important influence for the whole of Europe. And the so-called, what we always talk about, the Vandals invading Northern Europe in the third, 4th, and 5th centuries AD, and as if there were just a bunch of rude people that came. But these were people that had a very deep culture as well, because they were a nomadic culture. But there were, instead of, Hun was one of the words for inner being, and you had 3 Huns or 7 Huns, and you had a whole cosmology linked with that. Here is a glimpse. I told you that there was a very old story of how everything came from China. Well, here is a picture of how, from Africa. Here is a picture of how the initial movements came to China from Africa and settled. And very important was the Tarim Basin. From that Tarim Basin, that became the place of the Tocharians. From there, they went south through Bactria into India. And then the Silk Roads developed one northern route from Kashgar through Tukarka to Karaksar to Turfan, and another one through Yarkand and this way, and both ending up in China. Here we have the Indus Valley, which then becomes the Septa Sindhu, and then north of that was an enormous empire. Well, 2 enormous empires. Well, there was a little one, the so-called the Bactrian Margian Andronovo culture, and then the Andronovo culture that included the Aral Sea and went all the way to the Caspian Sea. There were major cities like Harappa and in Altintepe. It's the area that we now think of as Turkmenistan. And when we look at the city building in this area, we see that there are extraordinary buildings or extraordinary structures of fortified cities that are elevated. So at the end of chapter 12, I showed you Gurtepe, which was a square city, but there was also a set of round cities. So here you have Gayarkala in Turkmenistan, and here you have Takti Sulaiman, linked with Solomon, in Iran. Here you have Nisi in Turkmenistan, again on a high hill. And here we have Arbila or Erbila or Arbil. The latest research of this city, this is now linked with the Kurds and is really where all that fighting in northern Iraq is being organized from, or a good deal of it. The latest studies prove that this city was a high level of civilization, 148,000 BC. And this isn't just Kurdic archaeologists trying to, do local power shows. This is also including Hungarian archaeologists who are extremely reputable. So our notion of even what is an old city, if you look at Wiki, they'll tell you that an old city is between 5 and 7 or 8,000 BC. They admit that Aleppo and Damascus go back to 11,000 BC. But that there is a city 148,000 BC isn't mentioned at all. Well, here is that Middle Asia that includes Iran, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, south of Kazakhstan. And this whole area is extremely rich in its early languages and early cultures, and is one of the places where the Sarmatians were. And so here, another view of so this is the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, which bordered on the Mauryan Empire that we saw in the introductory lecture. And here, this part is called Scythia. And then you get the Kushan Empire, which takes over the Indus Valley area and integrates it in another way. And then there is a city called Balkh, and it's from Balkh in Afghanistan that two of the great cultures come from. One of them is the Sarbans, who become the Serboi, who become the White Serbians, and then move down to Serbia. And this is also one of the Cyrillic roots. Sorry, please. And the second group that comes from this general area, there are Tokharians from the Tarim Basin that move down to this general area and then become the Sarmatians. And they go first to this area between the Caspian and the Black Sea, and then move further to Sarmatia Europea. And here we have another. So now we're dealing with people that also call themselves Bulgarians. Remember, we saw that the Bulgarians were the Scytho-Sarmatians. So here we see them in Khwarezm or in northern Iran. And then they go to Great Bulgaria. And then you get Red Croatia, Great Hungaria, Bulgaria, the Bulgars, the Hungarians, the White Croatians, the Hrvatskas, and Bulgaria down here. And some of those move all the way, well, some of these, the so-called Togarmans from Urartu, go all the way from there to what is today Spain. Here are two maps of that area between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. This tells you that the top part is Sarmatia Asiatica, and this part is Sarmatia Europea. Well, in a modern map today, we can see that there are dozens and in fact actually hundreds of alphabets in this area. And here again a rough view of how the movements of the Bulgarians go. So they come from Afghanistan general area. They go first of all to this area between the two seas, and then they go to this area. From that area, they go in 5 steps. So first, the Bulgarians of Asparak, number 1. Then the Bulgarians of Kuber, remember Kubera. Then the Bulgarians of Alchek, which we would now call southern Italy. Then the Bulgarians of Pannonia, which we would now think of as Austria. And finally, the Bulgarians of Kotrag that go all the way up here to what we now think of as Russia. And so if we think back on those maps of the Scytho-Sarmatians that become the old Bulgarians aren't just a little tribe that, you know, a few people walking on horses and cross over and so on. They spread very dramatically from what is today the Ukraine, all the way to Italy and all the way to Russia in the course of a few hundred years, and established then a whole series of languages. And so what starts as a single alphabet splits off into a great number. So the Bulgarians then start a Bulgarian Khanate. Above that is an Avar Khanate. To the right is a Khazar Khanate. And here you have the Ak Bulgars, or the White Bulgars. And at its height, the First Bulgarian Empire covers pretty well all the area between the Caspian and the Black Sea and stretches out into Russia. And then it slowly, then you get Thrace and Bulgaria here, and then it splits into different countries, and then we get Bulgaria more or less into its modern proportions. And once upon a time, there was also then the Thracians, who covered all the way from Greece right up to what we now, well, the Scandinavian countries. Here you see another map of the Scythians, the Dacians, the Getae, the Illyrians. Here's another view of the Dacians, another view, and that is more or less synonymous with what we now call Romania. One, possibly the most complex of these funny names is the Scythians, because there is an ancient Scythian, Indo-Scythian kingdom that is roughly in the place of where the Kushan Empire was. Then there is a section of Persia or Iran called Sakastan. Then we have a large view of the Scythians here and the Sarmatians there, going all the way from Europe to nearly the Far East. Then we have Scythia, again, in this whole area, not just between the two seas, but stretching, again, this enormous thing. And then we have Sarmatia at the Black Sea with Scythia there. In fact, I've made a list of some of the major branches of Scythians. So we have Scythians who are Pashto and Ossetians, Scythian Sarmatians who are Shuvash and Proto-Bulgarians, Scythian Sarmatians and Getians who are Dacians, who then become Romanians, Dacio-Indians who again become Dacians and Romanians, Thracian Scythians, who become the Agathyrsi, who become Thracians and Romanians, Hunno-Scythians, who become the authors of the Szekely ruins and Hungarians, and then Scythians, Getians, Thracians, Massagetians, and Getians, who become Gothic German. And most of this is completely forgotten by most people. We have heard of Gothic, and most people think Goth is some kind of dress you wear if you're a teenager, and then German, but none of the rest of this. And when we go to the area north of the Black Sea, we see that there are at least there are Scythian plowmen, there are Scythian farmers, and there are Scythian nomads, and there are royal Scythians. Sorry, back. And from Scythia, there are groups that go down into Iran and go all the way through the Persian Empire to Egypt. This area becomes the Khazarian Empire, and the Khazars are they are people that converted to the Hebrew religion in the 700s and became an enormously important force. They're one of the reasons why there are so many Jews in Russia. And there are stories that 70% of the Jews, or the persons who call themselves Jews today in Israel, are originally Khazars. But it means that the people from the Old Testament if I, as a Christian, think of the Jews, I think of the people of the Old Testament, and Moses and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and so on. These people have nothing to do with that story. And they adopted the Star of Vishnu as the Star of Israel in the 13th century. And now we associate it as the Star of David, and if you say something against it, it's as if you were anti-Semitic, but in fact, it is an Indian symbol, not a Hebrew symbol, originally. And today, that whole area is now called the Ukraine. And of course, this is also where a lot of the turmoils of the world go, because this part was Russian. Khrushchev gave it away, and then Mr. Putin took it back. Here is an interesting province to the right called Sindica. And so this is, remember that S and H are, so this is Hindika, so this is an Indian colony that goes back to before Christ. And if you go back 1300 before Christ, there is a group called the Mitanni, now in Iran and Iraq. And the Mitanni used all the names of the Hindu gods. So there is a lot of the story that we have simply forgotten. But this is all extremely important because if we go to the normal accounts of Russia, well, this is the kind of map you'll get shown, that there were people from Scandinavia that made their way here to Kaluga and then down the rivers and finally went to Constantinople. And on the way, they founded the so-called Rus states. And the Rus states become these, so really a blob of land between Scandinavia and the Black Sea, and that expands and becomes this, and becomes the Volga Bulgarian Empire. Well, and this is supposed to be where Russia comes from. I was at a conference in Smolensk about 3 years ago, and I caused a stir because I said, yes, we know about this. And of course, there's lots of truth to it, but it's, according to this story, it's the going down here to Constantinople that they learned about the Greek and then wrote Cyrillic. Well, if we remember that the Scytho-Sarmatian, which ranged all the way from here to the Pacific, and that the Scythians came in all these different ways to this part of the world, and the Sarmatians went all the way through this part of the world. Only if we understand that can we realize why Scytho-Sarmatian becomes Old Bulgarian and has the structure of Old Russian. 2,000 years before the Russian alphabet officially starts in 800, or at least 1,000 years, but probably closer to 2,000 years, before it gets officially made by Cyril and Methodius, and the whole area gets taken over by Catholicism and so on. So we need to understand this official story, but if we don't have that deeper understanding of the interconnections between these cultures, we will never understand how Russia could become something that was just something along a few rivers to covering the largest area of land in terms of a straight line. It's 11,000 kilometers. Only Canada, which has 8,000 kilometers, is nearly as close. When we look at the early histories of these places, we start to notice some very strange things. So we realize that there is, from this area north of the Black Sea, so we showed how all of these people came to the Black Sea, but then in the more recent history, we see that there are stories of how they spread out from there. And then very interesting, and there's a group called the Afanasyevo group here in Siberia. And there is some kind of movement going this way, so from west to east. And when we look at the stories of the flood for this area, we see that around 5,600 BC, the people spread out all over the place. And if we look at the stories of peoples and populations, we're told that the Aryans spread out all over the place around 5,600 BC. Now, this is, of course, interesting because, the Vedic texts talk about a flood around 11,500 BC. The Bible, as interpreted by by the Hebrews, about 2,400 BC or 2,200 BC. So we have a series of floods. We have an explanation that the Aryans start here rather than in India, or more likely that they started in the Altai and moved downwards. Well, in fact, Ramesh tells me that there is one group that came from the Altai and one group that came from southern India, which seems more likely. But according to this story, there is an Indo-Aryan migration around 1750 BC, and that sweeps down into India and brings culture. Well, of course, this completely ignores the stories of the Mahabharata, completely misses the point that the Indus Valley was there 7,000 BC. Thank you very much. So we have various people making stories that conflict and completely contradict each other. And so here is a picture of how everything started from this part of the world and then spread out all over the place. This is a Eupedia map of early Neolithic Europe. And there is then a notion of corded ware in this area and Yamna culture. Now, that Yamna culture is very close to, etymologically, to Yama, because this is how they buried people, that's quietly ignored. And so here are other pictures of how this is supposed to have happened. The Aryans went down here to India, they went to China, and they went to North America. Then there is a group that says, no, that didn't happen from up there north of the Black Sea. It happened south of the Black Sea and near the Caspian Sea. And then you go to the experts and you want, the answer. Well, here are the major places. This is called the homeland of this Ur alphabet that we've been talking about. Remember, according to Wiki, this only happened 1000 BC. that sometime 3000 BC there was this Ur language, and then in 1000 BC it split out. Well, according to these people, it started about 10,000 BC. But here are these funny names like Jain, Gimbutas, Renfrew, Devoto, Diakonov. These are all the places where it's supposed to have happened, all those names. So we have all the way from east of the Aral Sea, all the way to Germany. This is a useful and helpful map, I think, because on the one hand it shows you that there is a Kukutani culture up here, also called Tripolye, and Tripolye is from, well, you don't need to be a great, the Indian, Sanskrit would be Tripura, it's 3 countries. The Greek would be Tripolis, from which we get Tripoli, and there's a Tripoli along this coast, and there's a Tripoli, of course, in Libya. And this is where those bird-like ladies with their curious spiral-like stomachs comes from. And this is also where that very earliest alphabet that I showed you comes from. South, Moscow's about there. And then we see that south of that, but not terribly far south, is Lebensky Vir, which is one of the first geometrical alphabets. And then here is Vinca, which is the other geometrical alphabets. And there, through the Black Sea, there were connections between these 2 great cultures. And in fact, here you see that culture ranged all the way down through what we now call northern Greece, and in fact, the whole of Greece. So we're now talking 5, 4, 3000 BC. So this is before Greece. It's before even Egypt, but it is that pre-history. And one of those cities that I showed, those ruins that I showed you right at the beginning, are supposed to go back to 68,000 BC. So it is this route that creates these geometric alphabets that link up with the Tamgas that I showed you in one of the earlier appendices, and that then lead the way to the proto-alphabets that we now associate with Western alphabets. The Russian claim that all the European alphabets comes along this route. In order to understand the big picture, we have to go back to China, because it was China that created a way of looking at the world cosmologically. In the center, there are a series of circles. In the center is the emperor, then the inner subjects, the outer subjects, the tributary states. And then in the far north, there are the northern barbarians. In the south, there are the southern barbarians. In the east, there are the eastern barbarians. In the west, there are the western barbarians. The word for north is Bei, and in the word for south is Nan. So we have the Beidi and the Nan Man. Now, in modern China, we have they also then linked their capitals to this. So there was a center called Xi'an, and then the north was called, well, the Jing was where the energy was. It's like the Ji or the Yan in your country. And so you get Beijing, the northern capital, and Nanjing or Nanking, the southern capital, and so on. Now, that is of interest in itself for barbarians, but then the barbarians were the Huns. Remember, the people in China were called the Han Dynasty, and the people outside, north of China, for which they built a wall to keep them out, were called the Huns. But the Huns then aren't just, again, a little tribe, they become colored. So now I get north, east, south, and west Huns. I get black Huns, celestial Huns, red Huns, and white Huns. Or to do it in terms of their names, the Kara, the Guk, the Al, and the Ak. And even without being a Turkish expert, you will know that there are the Karakoram Mountains. And if you look on maps, you'll see lots of Black Sea. Well, the Black Sea is the Kara, the Ak is the white, and even your Akshara. Now, if we go to Russia, we find that we have a northern, an eastern, a southern, and a western Russia, a white Russia, a green Russia, a black Russia, and a red Russia. And those words are Bel, Zelenie, Klin, Chornaya, and Chervona. And so if we start to look at Eurasia as a whole, we have Mongolian, Turkic, Turkish, Kyrgyz, Croatian, and Russian. Ak-Harakara becomes Ak-Kizilkara, becomes Ak-Alkara, becomes Ak-Kirmuzi-Sia, becomes Ak-Kizilkara, Bilea Cervena Sirna, Bela Cherven Chorna, Belo Krasno Cherno, and as in Chernobyl. So names that, you know, Chernobyl, Karakoram, we use and we think, oh, interesting, curious name. But if we look at this, we realize that these colors, white, red, and black, which also come up in the flags of these countries a lot, are not just names, they are also orientations. Here is a map of ancient Lemuria again, and showing you how, and that paradise was here somewhere in the Indian Ocean, and gives you one idea of how this all spread. Now, from this map, it is actually in the Indian Ocean south of India that everything goes to Africa and to Eurasia. I show you the ancient Lemuria again. And so there are two contrasting histories of the world. One that everything starts in Africa and goes to Asia and Europe and Australia and to North America. And the second, that it all starts in India and goes to Africa and so on. And that through this whole DNA project, what was supposed to have started 2 million or 1 million years ago really just got started 75,000 or 65,000 or even 40,000 years ago. But if we go back to the old stories, we have a different account. Now these may all fit in, that is to say, maybe there was, well, according to the archaeologists, there was a first movement, 2 million, and a second movement that took people up here into Russia, into the Altai by 1 million before Christ. And as I mentioned to you, there were 4 areas, one up near the North Pole, one down here, one near Lake Baikal, and one near what we now think of as Western Russia. Just for fun, I show you an Indian map. And of course, we think of India as India, but look at some of the funny names connected here. We have the Kurus, of course, and they have their fighting here in Middle India, as you will recall from the introduction. But here we have the Uttara Kurus. And here is the Deva territory. This is an Indian map. And then we have the Gandharam and Chakeya and various others. So these Uttaru Kurus in some of the stories, they are the first ones. And they descend into India. So that would fit in with this idea that there was a descent downwards from the Altai, from the Denisova cave, for example, which has been archaeologically dated as going back to 1 million BC, and where there is activity with Scythians between, very active around 40,000 BC, and they would then come down, and so long before the 1750 AD attack of the Aryans from what is now Bulgaria and Romania down here, there is this movement down south. And according to the Russians, it's these two Aryans with the two Slavic that creates the modern Russian. Here are two other Indian maps. Here the Uttaro Kurus again. Here is Ketumalu. Here is Meru and Ayodhya, which is today, and Kashi, which is, Ayodhya is, I believe, the old word for Delhi, is it not? Or near Delhi. And here you have Jambu Vipa and so on. Here you see the same. And this map I showed you. Now, purely speculative, but to suggest to you or tickle you in the direction that there is a much older story that we have forgotten. We all know that the most important mountain in this part of the world is Kailash. It is typically called Meru. If we go to Kailash, we will realize that Kailash is there, and just south of it is another mountain called Meru, right on the banks of Manasarovar. But if we go to Africa, if we go to Java, there is a mountain called Sumeru. And if I go to Africa, there is a mountain called Meru. And if I go to the Altai, there is Tengri, which is the mountain linked with Tengri, which goes back to our magic symbol. And there are 4 sacred mountains called Bogdashan. And so these are considered the most sacred mountains of Siberia and Mongolia. And so there is an extraordinary way in which the sacred mountains linked with the shamans seem to be linked with those early versions of the alphabets, then get linked with the notion of Meru, but Meru is on the one hand a place in Tibet, Java, and Africa, and there must have been a connection at least 100,000 and possibly even 1 million years ago, and that from that intellectual framework, the connections that led to all those roots that I was telling you about got started. Now that's all conjecture, we don't know, but there is no doubt that there is a connection between the ancient shamanic, the early Slavic, and then the alphabets that come out of that. These maps are not a GPS of how it all is today, but they are a first glimmering that the story that we're telling is a Eurasian story and not just one that started on the coasts of the Mediterranean. Thank you very much.